I serve as Associate Dean for Equity and Justice in the University of Pittsburgh School of Education, Executive Director of the Center for Urban Education, and the Helen S. Faison Endowed Chair, a distinction honoring the contributions of Dr. Helen S. Faison, one of the first Black teachers in the Pittsburgh Public School District, and both the first woman and Black person to hold the position of high school principal and deputy superintendent. Our Summer Educator Forum ends on Juneteenth, a date that asks us to devote ourselves to radical imagination and organizing in our work. One consistent myth about Juneteenth is that enslaved Black people did not know they were liberated from chattel plantations until a white general, Gordon Granger, read a proclamation to spell it out. This myth erases the many Black people who indeed knew, who joined various efforts to free themselves from chattel bondage and delivered freedom news to each other. It also conceals the counterinsurgent and brutal tactics of so-called slaveholders to enslave until they could no longer. We know this reality differently than the story the myth tells because of the work of historians. This is the kind of intervention Black educational histories make to forge futures. They summon the power of memory, which is important in US schooling contexts that require forgetting knowledges in order to learn. The Akan principle of Sankofa, which Marimba Malayans mentioned in the recent Pittsburgh Education panel, reminds us that any move forward, any discussion about futures requires a return to the past. I'm grateful to our plenary historians and facilitators, our youth, our Pittsburgh thinkers, who carefully guided us through time and space, mapping the philosophies and methods for self-determination and freedom. Heather Williams reminded us at the outset of this forum that literacy was essential, not only for reading the word, but the world. And James Anderson emphasized that literacy is inseparable from the struggle for freedom and equality. Our rich discussions, both in plenaries and breakout sessions, identified many coordinates for thinking and work, but I will highlight a broad area. I'll be brief, as I know our keynote speaker will summarize the charge. But I will say that our historians have made the case for transformative practice in our work. Writer Leanne Simpson offers a framework for transformation this way: how we live, how we organize, how we engage the world. The process not only frames the outcome, it is the transformation. The how is what changes us. My colleague Sabina Bart and I have shared this principle across the Pitt School of Education with our own faculty colleagues to guide thinking about commitment in every aspect of our practice. I offer this here with an opportunity. The Center for Urban Education invites you all to take up the work of collective study. Donna Murch discussed this point beautifully in our opening session. Marimba Malayans discussed a personal narrative of study groups this morning in our Pittsburgh Education panel. To address structural injustices, study groups must prioritize Black and Indigenous knowledge traditions, which set aside Eurocentric mindsets and operations that majoritize, repress, and counter any serious equity and justice efforts. These traditions are clear. Knowledge must be internalized in the self, relevant to their lived circumstances and for the collective. Taking a study approach means we aim not simply to incorporate people within the current system of schooling, but that we engage in a collaborative effort to transform practices and experiences in schools and other settings. Nearly every panel, including our youth panel, underscored the urgency of study groups to begin to respond to the kinds of concerns that they have about their experiences. Our youth shared narratives illustrating the limitations of thinking about equity and justice in terms of only some materials like computers, without attention to the social, economic, and political realities of students' lives, without attention to families, community, stress, and trauma, and assumptions about how all people learn. The power of study can deepen existing partnerships, identify possibilities for new ones, and establish the reparative and humanizing systems required within Western supremacist education settings. Collective study is a work of commitment, and the Center for Urban Education invites you to attend ongoing events and think about how these events can support collective study in your own institutions and places. The School of Education Department of Teaching and Learning recently launched an education leadership series titled From Freedom to Liberation to help participants think through some of the ongoing complex conditions that school district and organization leaders encounter, and to situate those in the current global uprisings and movements for racial justice. In addition, the School of Education invites you to learn more about our Pitt Ed Justice Collective on our School of Education website, which lists several opportunities for work with us, including study groups with many educators. Study builds strategy. Think about the promise and impact of this idea on how we make policy, lead, teach, and learn. For more information, you may contact us at CUE at pitt.edu. Many of us discuss our intervention priorities around a critical need for recruitment of individual Black teachers or administrators, but without its twin regard for the purposes, ideologies, and systems, and the study that we all need to redress our miseducation about knowledge. Linda Perkins, Elizabeth Todd Breland, and Salah Uddin this morning suggested this in an analysis of Black conversations that may center an individual instead of the justice concerns of masses of Black youth and communities. Studying Black knowledge traditions, which include everyone, is urgent for recovering what was lost and forging futures that not only seek to change the demographics, but transform the very structure and work is essential. During study, you may identify ways to foster reciprocal mutual aid relationships with various excommunicated people and organizations to guide educational practice. And there's no way around this within education freedom struggle. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to take this time to thank the Heinz Foundation for their sponsorship of this year's forum, which supported our ability to offer it without registration costs. This aligns to our vision that what we were doing this year is a public service and therefore should be free and open to the public. As Executive Director of the Center for Urban Education, I am indebted to a creative, hardworking team of faculty, staff, students, Heinz Fellows, our breakout session leads, our Dean Valerie Kinlock, University and School of Education support staff, and our special thanks to Fantasy Zellers and her Bounce Limited team for a smooth virtual forum, which is tedious work. We are grateful to artist Mikael Owuna, DJ PVO, which stands for Positive Vibes Only, and our hardworking ASL interpreters. And finally, thank you for attending this year. We hope you will continue to engage and share these talks with others. They are available on the Pitt Center for Urban Education YouTube page. The Center for Urban Education's videos and readings, including this year's forum, can create a syllabus for study groups. Let me remind you that if you are not signed up to receive updates from the Pitt Center for Urban Education, we can fix this easily. Please visit our website at qcue.pitt.edu, click Contact, and complete a very brief form to join our mailing list so you can stay up to date about our events and initiatives. And now for our closing keynote. I can think of no one better for this theme and our lived moment than Vanessa Siddle Walker as a keynote speaker. Vanessa Siddle Walker is the Samuel Candler Dobbs Professor of African American Educational Studies at Emory University. For 25 years, she has explored the segregated schooling of African American children, considering sequentially the climate that permeated segregated schools, the network of professional collaborations that explains the similarity across schools, and the hidden systems of advocacy that demanded equality and justice for the children in the schools. Her research has garnered a number of awards, including the prestigious $200,000 Grawemeyer Award for Education and the American Educational Association Early Career Award. In addition, she has received awards from the Conference of Southern Graduate Schools, the American Education Studies Association, and 3 awards from AERA divisions, including the Best New Female Scholar Award, the Best New Book Award, and the Outstanding Book Award. Walker's current research project, Hidden Provocateurs, brings to light the history of Black educators in the fight for justice of Black children. It examines Black educators' activities to demand equality in the generations before the Brown v. Board of Education decision, their interconnected story with the Brown v. Board of Education decision, and their continued advocacy after the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Walker has consulted widely with media, participating in the PBS special, School, and has shared her research nationally and internationally for more than 25 years. In 2012, she delivered the American Educational Research Association's annual Brown v. Board of Education lecture in Washington, D.C., with the webcast viewed by more than 500 people across a number of nations. Since the Brown lecture, she has provided keynote addresses for the U.S. Department of Education, the National Organization of Black Elected Legislative Women, the Kansas City, Missouri Emancipation Proclamation Celebration, the University of Cape Coast, Ghana, Teachers College Columbia, Howard University, among many institutions. Walker is a former National Academy of Education Fellow, and in 2009 was named a Fellow of AERA. She was president of AERA for 2019 to 2020. A towering intellect, a spellbinding storyteller, and consummate historian, she gets the final word in this year's forum. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Dr. Vanessa Siddle Walker.
I have extraordinary memories of being in Pittsburgh at the UPitt Center for Urban Education in 2018. It was an extraordinary time, and I particularly enjoyed the time I was able to spend with the community. I want to thank you, Dr. Dancy, for the invitation to come back. You've gathered so many important stakeholders into the space, and it is truly an honor that you would entrust me to add my voice into this dimension. I thank you as well for the kind introduction. I realize you all have been talking for several days, and as you head out, I want to say just a little bit about rethinking, remapping, and renewing commitments. We rethink a history that we've been taught. I want to use it to perhaps remap a chart for the present, and then, if possible, challenge a renewed commitment to pick up these old possibilities and apply them in a new space. Because I actually really do believe that children matter and that we have to make a difference for them in our generation as people did in their generations. So let's begin with the story of Brown v. Board of Education. I'd like to use this as a centerpiece, if you will, for our rethinking. This is a story that we know. We've been taught it in schools, and we are relatively comfortable and familiar with Brown v. Board as a victorious case when America actually repents for its mistreatment of children over time. The story we know is one of victory. It's one of courageous and joyous parents. It's one of smart opportunities. And this was a case that was supposed to create equality for everyone. It's an important case for us to think about and center this conversation, because the story that's embedded in Brown v. Board of Education is not just a Southern story. The truth is that school desegregation happens in the North approximately 100 years earlier than it did in the South. But we see the same story, whether it's North or South, whether it's the Roberts case in Boston, whether it's New York City, or whether it's Pittsburgh. So I want us to rethink the story that we know about this case, because I think if we rethink it, we might discover that the story has some keys to unlock complications that we face today, whether we're in the North or the South. So let's look at this case a little bit closer. Now, out of the spotlight behind Brown, the part of the story that we never talk about publicly, typically, historically, do not talk about publicly with Brown, but that is deeply etched in the memories of Southern Black communities, is a story of schools and the kind of education that was created in the schools. Now, this story is concealed in some ways. It's not that the Brown story we know is untrue, it's just that it's incomplete. It does not take into account this facet of what's actually happening in Southern schools. So in this story of schooling literature, there are these arguments for equality, but there's this resilience of her people. So many decades ago, when I first started this work, I was in a community and they kept saying, we had a good school. We had a good school. And I'm trying to figure out, what are they talking about, right? Because I've just finished my so-called fancy degree, and nobody in my graduate school ever talked about Black people having a good school and segregation. The inquiry, the time I spent trying to understand what they meant about we had a good school ultimately led to the first book in this series of work on segregation, which was Their Highest Potential. Now, what did I learn in Their Highest Potential that explains this underside of the story that's invisible in the Brown account? Well, there are lots of things that I learned, but very quickly, the professional leadership, teachers, and principals. These people didn't know they weren't professionals until desegregation. They bring an understanding about what to do and how to do it, and they operate in a professional sphere. The schools always had this interpersonal and institutional caring, meaning people cared for people, teachers for students, principal for teachers, but also the institutional structures reinforce the interpersonal caring. So that if I'm a student, I hear from a teacher that I matter, but I also hear from the school structures, the clubs, the assemblies, right, that I matter and I have potential. We see a kind of curricular alignment and expansion. So we want to make sure that Black children know everything that white children know in their schools. So let's make the curriculum like what the state says. But at the same time, these are Black children who are being mistreated in the larger world. So we also have to expand it, teach them who they are and how they can achieve in this world. And these schools have committed parents. We see it in the PTA, we see it in the money that they provide, we see it in the advocacy that they give. Now, at the time I wrote Their Highest Potential, I thought the school that I wrote about, Caswell County Training School, was, you know, just special, right? A really important school. When I began to lecture about this school in places across the country, I was just distraught to learn that apparently there were lots of schools like this school that I had written about. There were lots of Black communities who had put the same structures in place in order to make sure their children could reach their highest potential. Thus, how do you explain this similarity across the South? I really could not figure that out. Thus began the second foray, which would lead to Hello Professor, to try to understand why you could get such similar schools over time and across geographic spaces. So here's what I want to share with you about what I've learned in the years since I finished Their Highest Potential. Here are the aspects about these schools and how they were able to deliver, what they were able to deliver for the children. And there are two different dimensions that I want to explore. The first of these is this organized delivery of aspiration. What I learned in exploring the hidden dimension of these schools is that a pedagogical network existed throughout the South and into the North. And this pedagogical network helps explain how we got the school that I wrote about with Their Highest Potential. Now, here's what the network looked like. You've got a national climate, right? In some cases, it's supporting a little bit of education for Blacks, but most of the time it's not. You've got a local climate in the South, which typically is not supporting the education of Black children. And then you've got these other advocacy efforts happening nationally and locally that are aimed to support the education of the children. Now, the educators live in this space, right? These are professional people, so they understand what's happening nationally, they understand what's happening locally, they know what the advocacy efforts look like. And so in their own meetings, you see here, I've labeled them the ATA and the Association. The ATA is the Black counterpart to the NEA, the National Education Association. The Association, and for whatever reason, they did put the emphasis on the ASS. The Association is the Black counterpart to the Southern Association, the accrediting agency in the South. Both of the white organizations, they could not be part of, right? They couldn't operationalize their interests for Black children, and they couldn't even meet, right, in the South in these spaces. So their associations are built out of restriction and oppression, but within these spaces, they bring in the larger national climate about what's happening, what our children need, and in these national spaces, they talk about how we are going to educate Black children in this climate. Now, the national ideas do not just stay wherever they happen to have had the national meeting. You can actually identify these ideas being filtered through the state organizations. Every state had a structure like what you see on the left. And so this notion of when you go back into your states, there's a state meeting, there are regional meetings, there are local meetings, there are publications. In this space, the ideas filter, and Black teachers embrace them with rigor. In Georgia, for example, 8,000 teachers in the 50s at regional meetings, thousands of teachers at state meetings, local meetings. So they are very serious about this network and the ability to disseminate ideas through this network. Now, when I, excuse me, when I wrote Their Highest Potential, I did not realize that the ideas that I identified and just quickly overviewed for you that were dominant in this space in the segregated world actually are ideas that we can now document in this pedagogical network, not just filtering into North Carolina and into the school that's I wrote about in Their Highest Potential, that we can see these same ideas filtering through Southern states across. This pedagogical network is extraordinarily powerful. What it does is create a systemic way to reconfigure these negative societal messages, right? In the larger network, Black children can't do or be anything, right? That's what the society says. But through this pedagogical network, they're able to reconfigure these messages and actually make Black children want to achieve. They are, in effect, preparing the children for a world that does not yet exist. I mean, think about it. When they say, you can be anything you want to be, right? We want you to reach your highest potential. The truth of the matter is that in their world in segregation, the kids really could not have been Barack Obama and gone to the White House. What they're doing is laying the foundation for another generation. Now, all of the ideas are there. We could talk about testing, we can talk about the caring, we can talk about any number of dimensions, and I could trace them through. I don't want to do that today. I want to use only one example because I think that example helps to provide fodder for where we could go forward with a number of ideas. So let's just take one. Let's give you one example. If we were to think about civics education, something that they talk a good deal about in their networks, we could actually, on the national level, in the climate, see Lucy Laney, a Georgia educator, at an NAACP meeting talking about, we're going to do something we know is going to work, she says in 1919. We're going to teach these children about the vote, democracy, citizenship. We're going to teach them all of these pieces, she tells an NAACP meeting in Cleveland. Then you see, if you move into the ATA meetings and the association meetings, you see people like W.B. Du Bois and other people in higher education, as well as school principals, talking about, now, how will we get this curriculum, a civics curriculum, into the school? If you move it down, you will ultimately see discussions at the state level, at the regional level, at the local level, and even state publications. In Georgia, the cover of one of their teacher journals says, These are the future citizens of the United States, right? And there are pictures of Black children on the cover of the journal. In New Orleans, Valina C. Jones decides to organize her entire school around a democracy. And the children are not just doing fake tasks, they're actually intricately involved in decision-making in the school in alignment with parents. The cutest thing I think about it is that the first and second grade couldn't do anything. They were the territories. But the other people were senators and representatives, an extraordinary pull on civics education. In Atlanta, the school that Martin Luther King would eventually attend as his high school, Booker T. Washington, has its principal in the decade before Martin Luther King ever arrives, telling the children, you must be citizens of the world. And he said, and if the world treats you with hatred, you must respond with love, right? Something that we will later associate with King with someplace else, but is foundational in his own high school. Of the activities of Booker T. Washington, the Atlanta Daily World, the Black newspaper in Atlanta, captures well what we are later going to see. They reflect on the ways in which Booker T. Washington is involving all of these kids in elections and inauguration day, and the community is present and the band is playing and flags are waving, and all of this at a time when Black teachers cannot even vote. This is what we are going to see erupt later in these pictures, this familiar picture that we've seen, but the signs look a lot like what the children have been taught in school in previous generations. And we've often not made the connections between the curriculum that they were taught, teaching children to aspire, to be participants in a world that does not exist and help them to make it so. But the Atlanta Daily World, that Black newspaper, figures out what will happen if this curriculum is continued. Here's what the Atlanta Daily World says. If the young people of today are trained in the use of the ballot, these same young people will not sit passively and let themselves be barred from complete citizenship. And of course, that's what happened. So this is the hidden world. This is the pedagogical world that existed while Brown is being litigated. This hidden world is essential for us to demask, because we have to think about the possibilities in schools, even in oppressive spaces, even when you're in a segregation, which these people were. So we unmask on one hand this systemic way of delivering aspiration to children and making them believe in what they can do. But that's not the only world that's hidden in the Brown v. Board of Education case. Here's the second one. This is the organized delivery of advocacy. Now, this world is one that educators carefully hid. To let it be known would make them vulnerable in not just demeaning ways, but sometimes even with loss of life, as happened with Professor Moore in Florida. So this story of educators and advocacy has not been mined very well, difficult to find. It took me 18 years in writing Lost Education of Horace Tate to really put it together and figure out what they were doing. They were so careful to cover their tracks. But we have to know this world because it changes our understanding of how advocacy happens. We have to write educators into the script of courageous parents and smart attorneys. So let's look at this story of advocacy and the real agency in advocacy that's gotten lost. On the left side here, you see the story that we record, right? The one that we know. The NAACP makes Brown happen. We've got a national vision for what we're trying to do, and this national vision will filter down through national meetings, state meetings, and into local branches. The local branches, cognizant of what's happening at the grassroots level, will then get this local information, and they are going to send it all back upwards to the national. So I put this actually in a muted color because while this is always the vision, it is not always the practice. So you get James Weldon Johnson during his era of NAACP leadership talking about, we want this to work, right? Like we labeled it. We've got a vision, we carry it down to the locals get us the information, and they feed it back up. And you hear Charles Houston, the brilliant attorney, saying the exact same thing in his era. They want the network that you see on the left, but they don't have it, especially in the South. There are a lot of reasons why they don't have it, right? Some of it's fear. Sometimes it's poor communications between the Northern vision and kind of Southern realities. There are a number of possibilities here, but we won't go into all of those now. But whatever the reason, the truth is that the Southern branches are not working so effectively that they will allow people to gather all of this information and feed it back up to the national so the litigation can happen. It was very interesting to me in the Library of Congress to look at Mary White Overton's request to Southern branches, let's say in the 20s, for information about schools and schooling conditions. She asked, but you see very few responses coming from the local branches. Now, who had the network that the NAACP wants? The reality is that the educators have the network. And they've had this network actually since the turn of the century, although it certainly strengthens in the decades that follow. Now, on the right side, you see the exact same structure that they use to filter pedagogical ideas, but now it's operating from the bottom up in order to create advocacy possibilities. So here's how the advocacy and agency worked in real time. Who knows which parents would actually litigate? Who has the data on the school conditions, right? These are the principals. Principals in these schools, the people who sit at the intersection of what's actually happening in the schools, but who are also in this network of educators. So in reality, you get principals like Horace Tate, whom I wrote about, who find out what it is that parents in his school are willing to do, school bus transportation, for example, carefully concealed from public eyes. I mean, funeral trucks, dark bridges, 4-hour drives into the night. I mean, amazing secrecy. He gets this material to the executive director of the State Teachers Association, in this case, Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper of the Educators Association gets the materials to the National NAACP for who will litigate, and thus you get a statement like Mr. Harper writes to Thurgood Marshall, "My dear Thurgood, as you have helped us in the past, here's what we need you to do today. The Georgia Teachers and Education Association is getting ready to move in on these school boards, right, who are denying resources to Black children." And Mr. Harper goes on to lay out the number of areas that they plan to litigate. So the case filters up through a principal to the executive secretary, through the educators network, and then over to the NAACP. The national part for the educators network, the ATA, the association, and later when people are starting to figure out what's going on, a new organization in COSTA that they named, Through that national space, they now funnel money over to the NAACP to fund the cases. What does the local NAACP do? Well, this is the organization that provides the name, not the agency, but the name for the litigation, so that when it comes out in the paper, it is what the NAACP is doing, not what the educators are doing. Now, this network explains why in the documents we can see that the memo Thurgood Marshall writes to local branches about how to put a case together actually shows up and is practiced in the files of the educators. It becomes the script the educators will use as they adapt it to fit their own spaces. This structure explains why you get Thurgood Marshall confirming that, educators are paying for their cases, right? This is when Charles Houston is looking for money from fraternities and sororities and other places. And it's not that these people do not contribute at a later period, but throughout, the educators are paying for the cases that they want brought to address school conditions. This also explains why in the Library of Congress, the request for school data that I talked about earlier with Mary White Overton, even if you move into the 1940s and the request for data, hard to find them there. But if you look in the files of the educators, you see data from across the state of Georgia with all the detail from every county on exactly where inequality exists. It was my honor to meet Donald Oliver and Hollowell, both of whom NAACP attorneys confirmed for me prior to their deaths that the advocacy in these education cases, it was the teachers. Attorney Hollowell says, the educators are behind these cases. They're providing the money, they're providing the plaintiffs, and they are suffering the sacrifices because they're the ones who are fired when people figure out what to do. Now, we've not understood this agency, this advocacy that operated in the educators network. So note the public press from New York City talking about a school suit in Georgia. If you read the case and if you read the article, you will see that the credit, of course, is that this is an NAACP case. That's what the press says, and that's what people are mad about. Well, what white people in Georgia are mad about. But if you look at the local branch files for this case, and I have looked at them in the Library of Congress, you will see that this local NAACP branch is not doing anything different from what the NAACP branches have been doing over the years, right? They have a baby contest and they send money to the national, and they're very good about doing that, but they are not, you cannot find in their files the agency for the case that they get the public credit for. So what's happening here? It's a trick. The Brer Rabbit West African tales actually did make it across the Atlantic. Ultimately, white children will read these stories, right? The rabbit, don't throw me in the briar patch, don't throw me in the briar patch. And he gets thrown in the briar patch and he said, hey, I grew up in the briar patch, I'm comfortable here, right? The trick. This trickster, the Brer Rabbit, the white children will read about his stories. Blacks were using as strategy. Put one person out front, and that person protects the people who can provide the information. Henry Hunt comes up with that idea here in Georgia. He talks about how, and he's intricately connected with all of the NAACP advocacy in the earliest years. Mr. Hunt says, Black people are victims of people who do crooked thinking. And the only way we can address crooked thinking is we have to outthink them. So then Brown is so much more than what we saw on the surface or wrote into history. It is an interconnected collaborative that required the courageous parents, and they were courageous, the smart attorneys, and they were smart, and the invisible educators who are making it all happen. Now here's the question. If we add this into Brown, both the pedagogical network that helps spur Black children to success and the advocacy network that help provide equal opportunity, then how does that help us remap the present? Well, I want to play with this just for a minute, and I want to suggest to you, if we remap our thinking of Brown, it will help us remap how we think we need to maneuver today. So let's look at this. Now, what did Black people understand about how to educate children and what Brown was supposed to accomplish? Aspiration. See, through the pedagogical network, Black educators already understood how to create school climates that would have children aspire to be, to become, to do things. They already understood how to do it, and how to do it not just for one child, but across the school culture. This does not mean they never made a mistake, but the culture we see in schools across the South, aspiration, they knew how to do this. What else did they know how to do? They knew how to advocate. It worked too. We got Brown v. Board of Education. And I would suggest to you that the 1968 case, the Greene County case that forced desegregation, happened in exactly the same ways. Through the Virginia Teachers Association, Black educators, it's the same structure. So they are behind this case as well. So aspiration and how to advocate to get how to get kids to believe they could be US citizens, and how to get America to create structures for its so-called citizens. Aspiration and advocacy, they understood these things. So what did they want in desegregation? They wanted access. They wanted the equipment and the resources that their children had been denied. Now, for Black educators, desegregation or integration, which is what they first pushed for, would bring all of these dimensions to the table. Children would be in climates where they could aspire. There would be advocates who would oversee the education of the children and be sure they had everything they needed, and the children would have full access to all that America offers. That's the additive model that Black educators sought in integration. But the reality of desegregation in the South is that the Black teachers and the principals who knew how to educate Black children, who created these schools that taught children to aspire, well, one of the first retaliatory factors for desegregation is that they were fired. Many of them were fired. Around 50,000 Black teachers and principals. These are the people who knew how to create the climate. They are fired. So they don't know anything that needs to be brought into desegregation, so nobody asked them, and we create a script that says, nothing really good happened for Black children till they were integrated into white schools, and so the knowledge that these professional educators had about how to educate was lost. We lost that. The advocacy, well, when the Southern associations of teachers, these state associations, were allowed into NEA forced mergers. That's fine. The only problem with the mergers is that once you had a merger with the white association, the activities that were historically part of the Black associations, particularly the advocacy for Black children, disappears. It was interesting to hear John Davis, who's hired by the NAACP, himself a former educator, president of one of the HBCUs, says, we can't hear a thing from the teachers out of Texas, he says, right after the merger of the Black and White Teachers Associations. So the problem is that the mergers dismantle the advocacy framework that served as a watchdog and that provided the information that attorneys and others needed to litigate for Black children. So what does that leave? Access. It's true that Black children got some access. It was better in the South, but it never fully happened. And we're retreating on the access, even today. So the additive formula that Black educators would create for Black children, a learning space where they could be inspired, where they could have advocates, and where they'd have access to everything, did not happen. And in real time, what happened was an exchange formula where, in order to get access, they gave up the climates, the aspirations, they gave up the advocacy and for access. And we never fully got the access. So where does that leave us? We can say it's just a story about Brown v. Board of Education. Thank you, Vanessa, this was interesting, whatever. Or we can bring these ideas into the present. And I want us to bring it into the present. Because you see, the desegregation story is the same old same. This Southern educational desegregation challenge that was created as a result of Brown, that requires a remapping of educational thought, is true whether you're in the South or in the North. The formula, what played out behind desegregation, governed children in a variety of spaces. In the South, we thought with desegregation, Brown having been accomplished, the Green case having been litigated, that there would be federal oversight to create equality. Because you see, if you withheld federal money from these places, then the people couldn't continue to perpetuate inequality against the children. So we'll give you money, and then you follow the federal guidelines about desegregation. But the South wanted the money, but it didn't want the federal oversight. So the South created magnet schools and offered it some limited access to Black children, but it didn't fully implement Brown, and inequality continued. This is what's going on in the South in the early 1960s. Then by 68, when the South is howling too loudly after the Green case in 1968, and we're gonna have to really now have open access, and everybody's gotta, desegregate, then the unspoken agreement becomes local control. Let's let the local people figure it out. Well, as people say in the South, these are the same people who have been perpetuating inequality against Black children all this time. School boards, superintendents. If you give it up to them to decide what's going to happen, you can be pretty confident that a lot of what will happen will be the continuation of inequality, maybe even its amplification. The sad piece is that a case that was supposed to provide equality for Black children, in its implementation in desegregation, actually became a case that would protect white children and their education. We kept the language of desegregation in the South, right? 1970, this is great. We're desegregating, we're integrating. But the practices that allowed full equality, those practices were disrupted. And over time, the inequality ushered in amplifies. So desegregation language, but inequality in practice. Yeah, well, that was the South, you might say. I'm not an expert on the history of Pittsburgh, but I did take some time to look at it. And if my understanding is correct, desegregation was not only a mess in the South in 1968, as the teachers and principals were being fired and the networks destroyed, but it was also in 1968 when the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission ordered desegregation in Pittsburgh. And isn't it interesting? In Pittsburgh, the response was just like what happened in the early 60s in the South. Oh, let's have magnet schools. That's a way to do it, right? Let's figure out how to have some language of desegregation without actually doing a lot. And by 1976, you have the court order, the kind that, you know, it's going to, that bound the South. 1969, 70 typically is when this full integration, so-called, happened in the South. But you all get the court order. And I noted that one of your city council women said that they would get Black children to better schools because, quote unquote, the resources are there, right? Sounds a lot like access. And what happens in Pittsburgh? Looks a lot like the South. White parents are going bonkers. I saw pictures of the protests of white parents. And so, of course, ultimately in steps your governor, Tom Ridge, and desegregation has ended. And today in Pittsburgh, as I understand it, like the South, the schools are still not racially balanced. It's up South, isn't it? It's the same old same. So one could argue then that in both places, desegregation has brought us to a place in our generation where the broad spread understanding about the education Black children needed in schools and the networks necessary to support advocacy really didn't come into our present, into our understanding. So let's think about a post-desegregation map. If we accept the reality that we are where we are, does that mean we just stay where we are and say, oh, well? Or did Dr. Dancy bring you together for bigger reasons? Can we take a history and use it to map a movement in the present, even in Pittsburgh, with the people who cared enough to come together virtually in this space over these days? So let's think about it for a minute. There's no question that desegregation has netted gains for many people. I'm one of those people. I'm very clear. Institutions I've been able to go to, things I've been able to do are directly linked to the sacrifices that people made to push the doors open. And there are others who have my script and are in the places that they are because of the push. But the original goal with integration, as they first wanted it, was not just to reward a few, but to educate all the children so they could be full participants in this American democracy. Everybody was supposed to be able to reach their highest potential. And we've not accomplished that goal. So to me, it's not okay that some people have gotten access to America's fullness and others have not. It seems to me that our generation needs to pick up the torch, if you will, and continue to push this country forward in a vision of equality that includes everybody. So if the old strategy was generational, which it was, we can document it from Reconstruction right up to 1970, then can we use the formula that they had to think about generational planning in the present? These are not hard and fast ideas, but they are concepts that I just, as I conclude, want to lay out for you and ask you to think about them as you continue to work together. Let's look at aspiration. I'm wondering if we can think differently about school climates today. The truth is that children learn in a context. As my mentor said, you're teaching something to somebody somewhere, Jackie Irvine said. And I wonder, as I read newspapers, how often schools today are inspiring children to believe, to grow, to learn. Are we actually so focused on the curriculum that we forget we're teaching it to children, and that if a child decides, I don't care about you or the curriculum because you hurt my feelings or whatever is happening, if the school is not safe, Do we really expect them to be interested in algebra? I think we have to take on aspiration in school climates on the interpersonal, institutional levels. I think we have to think about issues of curriculum. Who's teaching? Who's leading the school and how? Does the principal just have administrative leadership capacity or professional visionary leadership? As I wrote about it, Hello, Professor. It seems to me we need schools that don't reinforce the negative view that Black children already have in this country, because they're getting that now just like they were years ago, unfortunately. Back then, the schools reconfigured the image and made children believe in what they could achieve. The schools were safe. I'm wondering if the schools are reconfiguring issues today or if they are reinforcing the negativity that's already in the society. And what does it do to a child to be told in your country, in your school, in your classroom, that you don't matter, your life doesn't matter? Where are the parents? The Black model and segregation of parental involvement is actually very different than the way we talk about parental involvement today. In fact, if we were to measure the Black parents and their highest potential by the contemporary model of parental involvement, they would fail. But it doesn't mean they weren't involved. So this question of how do we think about involving parents in a variety of ways? What are the creative ways that we can bring them in? I think all of these are critical, that we need teachers and principals who can build this kind of school climate. And when we talk about that, right, we just set it down, at the floor of the universities, because we need professional preparation and professional development and teacher assessment measures. This is what we do in schools of ed, working in concerts with communities. And I think the fact that all of you are together, you have an opportunity here to think about how do we make the climate in the schools different, the leadership different, so we can get the kind of aspiration that earlier generations had. What about the advocacy? I was delighted. I was looking online and I saw some Pittsburgh teachers protesting and encouraging others to be a part of the protest. My question is, how can their work be extended? Historically, we had a network of advocacy. So how do you take what they start and move it into other places and pay attention to the issues? We know some of the issues, over-policing, for example, of Black children, attended to discipline. What do we do with that data? Do the parents know where the channel is to know how to get the information about what's happened to their children to somebody who knows what to do with it? And who's watching the politicians and calling out inequality and meeting with the congressmen to lobby for different kinds of bills? Where's the collective press in this matter? Who's talking to who? Is it okay to just legislate testing? I mean, that's what happens. It's not okay. We know that. So how do we push differently? How do we say you should compensate teachers in urban schools who are doing a harder job with more money? Or giving extra money for extracurricular and other activities that help develop whole people. So what's the overall advocacy plan? This is my question for you, and it's my challenge. What's the vision of where you're going? Or is the vision fragmented? Finally, access. The National Coalition has a bill before Congress right now on access, and I'm actually hoping to get the Pitt Center involved in this work. Now, the issue with access is not just white bodies sitting next to Black bodies, although there are researchers who argue and have wonderful data to show that when children are together, the life chances for Black children increase because of the amplified opportunity to access resources. But the issue is whether we get the Black and white children sitting together or whether there are spaces where they're not sitting together, the resources have to be the same everywhere. For teachers, the money, the professional development opportunities, we need the schools to have access to the same things. And so the strategies that advocate for schools need to also pay attention to access. Now, importantly, we fight for all three of these things collaboratively. This is what the Black educators understood in the South. The formula for desegregation was aspiring school climates, people who advocate and access. We need all of them, not attention to one and forgetting about the others. This can't be like the first school desegregation case in Boston, the Roberts case, where basically one generation says, oh, we need desegregation because we don't have good facilities and resources. And then they get desegregation. They say, oh, our children are being mistreated. We need our own schools, right? And it makes it look like the parents are kind of flip-flopping in what they want. It's not that they're flip-flopping. What they want is it all. Martin Luther King says this in one of his meetings with the Black teachers in Georgia. He says, no, we want it all, right? And I think we have to keep in mind we're pushing for all of those things. These are matters I learned writing The Lost Education of Horace Tate. The challenge I'm issuing to you today is deeply indebted to what I learned from this man you see on the right, Dr. Horace Tate. It was his hidden records you can see upstairs, that attic window where he kept about 12 file cabinets of untouched materials, things he hid at a time that Black history was being lost and intentionally destroyed. And it was his work that helped me see an old story in a completely new way. So before we go, Dr. Tate would probably have me remind you of one final point, and that is that it takes courage. He says it takes courage to choose to make things better for another generation of children. Everybody won't do it. But I hope someone among you will. I think we have to see clearly the problems we're confronting and how we got here. We can't be blind to them. So I'll end by quoting Horace Mann Bond, quoting Horace Mann. Now, Horace Mann is the person we consider the founder of public education. In 1849, this white male compelling people in the Northeast to provide education for their children says, "He who denies to children the acquisition of knowledge works devilish miracles." Of course, white children will be given the opportunity to have public education in this country. In 1963, Horace Mann Bond, the Black historian, appropriates the same truth when he's encouraging Black educators to make sure Black children have what they need. Speaking at one of those state teachers' meetings that I talked to you about, right in the midst of desegregation planning, Dr. Horace Mann Bond says, quoting Horace Mann, "He who denies to children the acquisition of knowledge works devilish miracles." So I'm going to end by applying it today to our circumstance and the children who are counting on our generation to deliver something different. He who denies to children the acquisition of knowledge works devilish miracles. I hope someone in this audience will begin to make the connections, create the collaborative push to make sure that the children matter enough to make America do right. I thank you for offering me the privilege of giving you some thoughts for the work that looms before you. I wish you Godspeed. I hope I have another opportunity to visit Pittsburgh.